Hello, good evening and welcome to tonight's Broadcasting Scotland. I am Martyn Day, and for a bit of a different show tonight, it's not going to be the regular roundup of news. The show will be entirely focusing on the life and achievements of Alex Salmond. I'm joined tonight in the studio by Campbell Gunn and by Marion Fellows. Welcome to the show.
Good evening.
Would you like to just say a few words about how you first met Alex to start us off?
I find it hard to remember. I joined, I'm really sorry to say, I joined the SNP when I was still at school. I was 18, which, sad to say, was 1966. And then I was a member of the Federation of Student Nationalists at Aberdeen University. And then I was a branch member in various places around the country as a journalist. I moved around. I was a branch convener in Bishopton in West Renfrewshire during the 79 referendum, which I presume must have been the first time I met Alec, because that was when he first came to prominence.
Yes.
as part of the 79 group.
Marion?
I met Alex in the early 2000s at Westminster because my son worked for him, and that was my first introduction before I was even a party member. I knew of him, but yes, that's the first time I met him.
Well, I didn't know who he was when I first met him, and I was a school kid, and I was given a yes sticker during that 79 referendum by Alec in Lithgow. So there you go. How small things can lead us on a whole pathway. So really pleased to have you with us. We've got a few tributes to come in, and we've got a tribute of Alec in action from a few years ago that we're going to play. I watched this earlier when he was commenting on the Chilcot inquiry. It's hard to believe so much happened in that short period that we were in Westminster together, but I challenge anyone to watch this clip and not just grasp how good a grasp he had of the facts and the politics of the situation. This, given the complexity of that whole saga, and we can have a wee chat about. I mean, that was just tantamount to how he operated, I think, right across the whole piece. So I'm running ahead of schedule here, but we'll have plenty of time to talk about the aspects, and I know Linda has the video clip lined up to play.
Well, the Chilcot report says that the intelligence wasn't clear, that the decision-making process wasn't right, the intelligence should have been challenged, but it also says, of course, it was presented in the wrong way, that they mixed up Tony Blair's opinion, which may well have been there were weapons of mass destruction, with the intelligence facts, which were much less clear. That doesn't get Blair off the hook. You know, he could have thought that there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq all he liked, but the reality is he'd told George Bush, A, he was after regime change, and B, he was with him come what may. Unfortunately, he told the UN weapons inspectors they wouldn't get the time they asked for, and he wasn't willing to even receive the intelligence or arguments which countered the accepted wisdom that the WMD must be there. Chilcot makes a highly telling point. He says that faced with exactly the same evidence, Robin Cook came to exactly the opposite conclusion, because he was determined to follow processes properly, and above all not to subvert the processes of the United Nations, which Tony Blair did. Well, I mean, he's taken total responsibility and then told everybody to do the same thing again. And it's in that phrase, you know, I would do the same thing again, that is the clue to further action. Now, legal action is problematic. It's problematic for the International Criminal Court because, unfortunately, the crime of aggression is not yet tested by that court. Won't be until at least next year. A pity, because Chilcot has acres of stuff on why this was a crime of aggression and unjustified war. The domestic criminal legal remedies in England, they've already, high courts have decided they'll only take international law into the domestic law if there's a specific instrument of Parliament. The question in Scotland is much more open, incidentally, but nonetheless the Scottish courts might follow that same argument. Civil action by the families, I think, will be strengthened by the Chilcot report. There's plenty in here about how poor decision making and preparation through inadequate equipment led to the deaths of servicemen and therefore servicewomen, and therefore families' case, if they take a civil case, will be strengthened. But I think the compelling argument is for parliamentary action. You know, it was Parliament who Blair was selling one line to while he was saying something else in private to George Bush. It was Parliament who were persuaded to go to war on a false premise and a false pretext, and it was Parliament who were persuaded to sanction the Prime Minister in undermining the authority of United Nations. And so hopefully it should be Parliament that finds the guts and the gumption across the political parties to say, look, a lot of this, as Chilcot finds, is about the processes of Blair government, about not going through the correct procedures, about keeping cabinet in the dark, about not having collective decision making, and no doubt lots of that can be sorted for the future. But at the end of the day, it's not the processes of government that make decisions, it's individuals that make decisions, and it was Tony Blair who made these decisions, and therefore that individual, that Prime Minister, that Tony Blair should be called to account, and in doing so is the only way of making sure that something like Iraq is never allowed to happen again. It would have to be cross-party. You have to have that sort of arrangement whereby people are looking at this in a parliamentary sense as opposed to a party political sense. Some of that, I think, didn't look good in the debate. You know, when the Labour are looking upon the Iraq as a pro and anti-Corbyn thing. I mean, it's unbelievable that, you know, people, despite the presentation of this report, are still talking as if, well, we were quite right to vote for the war anyway. Unbelievable. It's because Labour have got themselves into a mentality they have to defend the indefensible because they're taking sides with Tony Blair against Jeremy Corbyn. It's ludicrous. But there will be some Labour MPs who are prepared to take a different line. There's certainly some Conservatives who said, look, we were misled. If I had known this, clearly I wouldn't have voted for unjustified war. And then, of course, the SNP, the Liberal Democrats, Plaid Cymru and the SDLP have always had a consistent anti-war position. So there will be, I think and hope, a cross-party framework, and it has to be done on a cross-party basis, and we have to find a mechanism to hold this man to account. I mean, I was given 3 hours notice this morning. I worked out that that was 14,000 words a minute to get the whole thing read. So, you know, even I haven't read the whole report, but I've been able to read more of it than most. But people want to examine it in detail. They want the parliamentary debate on an adjournment motion for next week, and then people will talk and consider what proper parliamentary instruments can be used to bring this man to account.
Well, there we had a clip of him demonstrating his talents in action. I was always impressed with how well he could remember facts, and obviously speed reading and cramming in there as well. But over the years, he could just pull facts out of the hat whenever he seemed to need them, which was just one of those skills. Campbell, you had a lot of dealings with him in the Scottish Parliament. So.
Yes, well, both as a journalist and then as a special advisor. And it wasn't just facts like the background to Chilcot, which he managed to absorb all these facts. He had such a breadth of knowledge about Scottish history, about Scottish literature, about, always said that if he ever went on Mastermind, his specialist subject would be Heart of Midlothian, because his knowledge of Heart's history was unbelievable. I remember one time we were sitting in a planning meeting for one of the away cabinets up in the Highlands, and he was talking about, he went off on a tangent, as he often did, and he started talking about puffers, and he went on to the Vital Spark and Parahandy and things. And first of all, he said, he turned to me and said, Campbell, you've got Highland background. What was Parahandy's boat called? And I said, it was Vital Spark. I said, and what were the crew called? And I went through the crew, and he said, are you sure it wasn't? And I said, well, there were two cabin boys. There was the Tar, and then there was Sonny Jim, and that's right. And he was just testing it because he knew all that himself. It was just for fun and to distract it. And the civil servants sat there wondering what on earth was going on, you know. But that was typical of him, you know.
There was very little he didn't know anything about.
No.
Yeah. It was always a skilled operator. I mean, in the 2 short years that Marion and I were in Westminster with him, when he got up, he just ran rings round his opponents. He knew procedures like the back of his hand. A really skillful operator, and I think we all learnt a lot from him. I don't think we learnt it quick enough, if I'm being honest. But no,
there is that, and he always had his eye on the prize. You know, everything that came up was to lead towards independence.
Yep. Yes, it really is hard to believe that we've lost such a towering figure in our movement.
I had a call from it was actually from a journalist, and a television journalist, who, because I had acted as a spokesman during his dispute with the Scottish Government, a lot of the journalists still think I'm still his media spokesman, which I'm not. And I was asked, could I confirm the rumour they'd heard that Alec had died? And I was absolutely gobsmacked. And I said, no, I can't. I haven't heard anything like that. But I started phoning around my various media contacts, and of course, everyone had heard. And eventually we got it confirmed, and I just couldn't believe it.
And 69 is not an old age. No. It's I think we're all reminded of our mortality when we hear these facts. We've got a few tributes from people who couldn't be here tonight, but they've answered a number of questions about how they got to know Alec and their involvement. And we've got a wonderful clip from Richard Thompson from his involvement with him over a number of campaigns to come up. So, and I think it speaks for so much of how many of us knew him in campaigning. So we'll hear from Richard.
Well, Alec is somebody that kind of was somebody I'd long admired. The first time I was really kind of aware of him was when I became aware of politics more generally, and that was kind of in the lead up to the 1992 election. There was a great debate that was organised by the Scotsman newspaper in the Usher Hall between Alex Salmond, Donald Dewar, Ian Lang and Malcolm Bruce. And I little imagined as a 16-year-old watching that and tuning into the aftermath that, a few decades later I'd be working for one of them and Alex Salmond and, trying to defeat Malcolm Bruce as an MP in Aberdeenshire. But the first that really got to know Alec was I left my job with Scottish Widows to become head of campaigns for the SNP ahead of the 2005 election. And in that role as head of the campaign unit, I had a fair bit to do with Alec at the campaign committee meetings. And it was impossible not to be impressed at the guy and the experience he had and the insights he had and the directness with which he was able to put across that vision and how he was able to galvanise generally everybody round about to get pretty much the best that could be got out of everybody, myself included. After that, I left headquarters. I didn't need a head of campaigns when there was no elections going on. And I ended up via Stuart Hosey and Shona Robinson's office in Dundee down in London, where I became the head of research for the group of SNP MPs at Westminster, which at that time, of course, included Alec. Shortly after that, I was selected as a candidate in the Gordon constituency in Aberdeenshire, which for Westminster, which substantially overlaid the Holyrood constituency of Gordon that Alec had only recently been elected to himself in 2007 when he became First Minister. So I sort of was doing the kind of shuttling to and fro between Gordon and Westminster for a year, and then Alec offered me very kindly a job working in his parliamentary office, and it was there that I really got to see what I would consider to be the real measure of him, which was in terms of how he tended that political base in the North East that had given him the platform to achieve so much. The thing about the referendum campaign in Alec was it was here, there and everywhere, but there was always a special effort to make sure that we were doing things that were worthwhile when he was able to be back in his political backyard of the North East. And I remember somebody who was leading from the front in all parts of the campaign, who was, again, galvanising the best out of everybody who was around him, whether they were in the national campaign or wherever it was the local areas in which he was campaigning. But I think above all, it's just remembering, the chance that you could have, that you could be speaking as a yes activist, a member of the public who might be a bit unmoved by your arguments, but when they got to speak to Alec, if they had that opportunity, it wasn't just the charisma or the respect in which he was held that made the difference. He just had this way of being able to take the big issues and distill them down and put them across in a way that people instinctively understood. And, it was a rare gift that very, very few politicians have, to the extent that Alec had honed that over the years. Now, I don't think anyone's ever born with that. It's a learned behaviour, but Alec had certainly learned how to do that very effectively over many years in elected politics. And as I say, going out campaigning with him was just an absolute masterclass in how to go out, have fun, put your best foot forward and to have the best engagement that you can with the folk whose votes you're seeking. Well, the thing we've got to do, surely, is finish the job of making Scotland independent. Now, there's nobody, I think, has done more than Alex Salmond to shape the modern nationalist movement. And I think there are so many individual contributions, but two things I would pick in particular was the way that he reached out to communities within Scotland that had a traditional suspicion, I think, of, if not a traditional suspicion towards the SNP, then certainly a strong affiliation with the Labour Party. And I'm thinking particularly here about the big efforts he made to change perceptions of the SNP in the Scotland's Roman Catholic communities, and the way that he built up the Scots Asians for Independence, the New Scots for Independence, and really, really gave us this unashamedly unimpeachable civic nationalist identity. So there's so much that he's given to shape the movement. But so what we really need to do is build on that basis and move forward. I remember there was a quote from the novelist William McIlvanney that he was very fond of quoting for a while, which was that, we all go forward together or we don't go forward at all. And he got to know Willie McIlvanney a lot during the campaigns for a Scottish Parliament after the Doomsday election of 1992 and the Scotland United rallies. And I think there's a lot of that energy we need to reclaim. But the thing we need to remember is Scotland isn't ever going to become independent until we've got a clear and consistent majority of the people in Scotland in favour of it. There's no shortcuts, there's no routes to independence that previous generations of nationalist leaders have overlooked. It's about votes in ballot boxes and having enough of them. But in order to get to that stage, you've got to persuade people of the essential merits of your cause. And you've also got to persuade them that in terms of all the other issues they're interested in, whether it's the state of the economy, the state of our public services, the independence and the key question in politics of who decides is the golden thread that runs right through all of that. So that's what we need to be doing and working towards in order to persuade people that not just that they should want independence, but also that independence is the key to unlocking the good outcomes in all the other areas of human life and politics that they want to see. And that independence is something that is urgent and it's relevant, not just something that might be nice to have theoretically at some point down the line. Now, that requires the movement to, yes, recover some of its energy. I think it requires us to stop trying to find faults in those who are already persuaded. And we need to put our best foot forward in trying to persuade those Scots who are not quite there yet. Not just that independence is something that is necessary and will be good for Scotland and future generations of those who make their lives here, but also that it is the key to delivering in the medium term and the long term the kinds of outcomes that we all want to see in Scotland. And it's that, conveying that message of independence for what? The independence for a purpose, and about making sure that we are able to say that this is a means of being able to be who we are in the world, to make sure that it's our decisions about our country which are the ones that take primacy, and that we're constrained only by the limits of our own resources, the limits of our own imaginations, the limits of the choices that we make freely for ourselves, and not by the constraints that are placed on us by a political system where there are many, many more people voting elsewhere in the UK than we can ever muster in Scotland. So I think we need that unity of purpose. We don't all need to like each other 100% of the time, but what we do need to share is that love for Scotland, that desire for independence, and that willingness to go out and engage in good faith and in good heart with those who live beside us, who are not quite there yet in terms of being willing to support independence.
Well, I don't think I can disagree with a single word Richard said there. He summed it up perfectly. Alex certainly had an energy in campaigning. Having campaigned with him on a number of occasions, I almost felt like he was on a mission to personally shake every individual in the country's hand and have a chat with them, and he tried. And that's, I think, largely what we've all got to do. I sometimes refer to it as hug a granny. We've got to persuade, and love our fellow country people to get to almost to death, to just get them over the line and just convince them that we're sincere in what we're trying to achieve. And here a great way of bringing people across and getting people to listen.
Absolutely. I mean, I can remember a couple of by-elections I went out and campaigned in the Easter House, for one, where John Mason got in. And my husband and I went up to do more canvassing and stuff, and we kept getting stopped by folks saying, Alex Salmond bought me a wafer at the ice cream van, you know. But I reckon he must have won that day on the horses. But also, he was a divisive figure. I mean, I've been literally spat on as well by people because opponents were scared of him because of his appeal to ordinary working folk, and they couldn't envisage a Scotland that didn't have Labour at its heart. But again, locally, I mean, if Alex turned up anywhere, the crowds came out, and he could talk to anyone and everyone. Students that I had, when I let them away early, won the by-election in Livingston. And I got a phone call from my son who was with Alec and who said, Mum, did you let students away early? Because there's two of them here at the polling station. And one of the students that night actually joined the party and became an activist, having met Alec at the polling station that night. So he was a great crowd pleaser, but he was also very good with individuals.
Yeah, and as a special advisor, he could be a nightmare as well because of that. Because he spoke to everybody, everybody wanted to shake his hand, and everybody wanted to speak to him, and he would speak to them, and he engaged with them. He didn't just sort of say hello and move on. He would actually talk to them and ask who they were and talk to them, and you were supposed to get him to the next engagement, and he was running late. And
he was always late.
He was always late, yes.
Yeah.
Well, you know, if you were trying to keep him to a timetable, it was a terrible nightmare. But that was just the mark of the man, and, you know, he was a crowd pleaser, as you said, and he just loved meeting people, and they loved meeting him.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he certainly never passed you by if he knew you. I mean, even in the latter years of the estrangement from the party, anytime we bumped into Alec, be it up here or down the road in London, he always took the time and had a chat.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember bumping into him in Edinburgh Airport, and, you know, you didn't get away easily either, you know. If he was on a different flight from you, well, you were lucky if you made yours on time, you know.
Yeah, I mean, Richard touched on a few points there. You know, how do we galvanise the movement back together again? And, you know, that I think has to be the legacy we need to.
Well, what I actually said about civic nationalism,
yes.
that was in the run-up, through the 90s, in the run-up to the 97 referendum, and then the establishment of the party, the parliament. That was, I mean, we were all united, there was no differences, and what we need to get back to is this civic nationalism and this stop the catcalling from one party to another. I mean, I worked for Alec, and during, as you know, during his dispute with the Scottish Government, I was his media spokesperson, but I never ever joined ALIPA. I joined the SNP, as I said, when I was 18. I'm still in the SNP. The SNP is my party, but I still got on well with Alex Salmond, and, you know, I think other people have got to see the bigger picture here. Independence is the big picture.
It is, and I think, you know, from my dealings with Alec over the years, and we didn't always agree on things, is he didn't hold any grudges.
No,
you know, and that's the attitude we've all got to take. You defend your corner robustly, but you don't hold the grudges, and you work together for the common objective. Marion, were you wanting to?
No, I was just going to say that was never more apparent than when he was at Westminster, and when you think about this, I was amazed, as you said earlier, Martyn. He understood the procedure of the place. He could run rings round people who were and the number of MPs who were really pleased to see him back. Now, not all of us wanted to see him back in Westminster. We wanted him probably still in Scotland for a great deal of the time. But he moved things forward, and he always could see things that would benefit the independence cause, or that would actually, he could speak against things. I remember when they were talking about restoration and renewal, and there was big debates at group meetings about, what do we do with this, what do we do with that? And I've always, and I said it to people for years afterwards, Alex's attitude to that was, well, we don't care if the whole place falls down and lands in the River Thames, because, we want it to be safe for our staff, but it's nothing to do with us. It's just a building. Yeah.
Absolutely. We've got a few other comments, and I think it leads in nicely to some of the comments that Philippa Whitford was saying. Philippa worked very closely with Alex during the referendum, and indeed even latterly. So we'll hear now from Philippa.
I think, like most people who knew Alex Salmond, whether close up as family, friends, or colleagues, or simply as First Minister and a political giant in Scotland, I think the main feeling right now is still shock, particularly for me, as I took part in Alex's event in Glasgow last month to mark 10 years since the independence referendum. And that's where I first met Alex. I had been giving a speech at a Business for Scotland event in Dynamic Earth, and he was the keynote speaker. And suddenly I was tapped on the shoulder by a member of his staff and asked to come and meet him afterwards when he was explaining the impact on polling that my talks around Scotland were having, and encouraged me to keep going. I next met Alex at the SNP conference that autumn when he was suddenly trying to convince me to go to Westminster. I can't say he fully convinced me, but he did convince my husband Hans, who suddenly joined all the others who were nipping my ear to stand for Westminster in 2015, which of course I eventually did. The final straw that broke the camel's back was actually a Women for Independence event, when I thought, if not me, who? Alex supported my campaign and also was a colleague, of course, for 2 years at Westminster, when frankly in the House of Commons chamber he was simply a force of nature. It has always saddened me that the independence movement has split in recent years, and I would certainly hope in Alex's memory that we can come back and come together and work together, because it's not about having to be one party. I don't think that's important, but we do need to treat each other with respect and cooperation, and remember that what we have in common, this common goal of independence, is more important than the fact that we disagree on certain policies or that we don't get on with certain personalities. Gaining independence is really hard, and we see that if we look at history. There are countries that have only gained their independence through war and bloodshed, where Scotland is trying to follow a democratic route, and that means there's no shortcut. You have to convince the majority of people who live here. And therefore, I would like to see all of those who believe in independence and Scottish sovereignty working together, whether you are a supporter of ALBA or the SNP or no party at all, so that we're actually reaching out to those who are not yet convinced. Because in the end of the day, we all want to deliver an independent Scotland, to deliver Alex's vision of a fairer, greener Scotland that we can actually leave to our children and grandchildren.
Yeah, again, I mean, Philip has hit a lot of that on the head for us there. How do we do it though? That's the big question. I mean, I think I've said to a few people, I think Alex's legacy is unfinished because we've not delivered the objective. But one of the things achieved was the normalisation of the whole independence concept, which prior to Alex coming on the scene and prior to the referendum was not the case. We were the fringe loonies, and almost into, for many years we tried banging our head against a brick wall trying to persuade people of the merits of independence. Now the concept's understood. We inspired, perhaps even radicalised the whole generation. But how do we take it the next stage forward and get more people on board? And that's the big question. And I think both Philippa and Richard made the comment, there isn't a short circuit. There really isn't. We've got to win the hearts and minds, and that's talking to people and persuading them and not being diverted. And I make this point quite often. You've probably heard me say it before, Campbell, as well. We've got to make sure, fellow travellers in the independence movement, that we don't shoot at each other. Yeah. And when we disagree, it's a small enough coterie within our movement that we can pick up the phone or reach out via a friend to whoever we want to have a chat with and do things offline. But we should be amplifying what we agree with and having a respectful debate where we disagree, because diversity is a strength and it adds to what we can take forward.
And without naming names, some people just have to bury their egos a wee bit and fight for the bigger, as we've all been saying, the cause is more important than any individual or any individual party.
You've hit the nail on the head. I recall one of those irate conversations with Alec when he spoke to me about the problem with effing SNP councillors was effing egos, and I'm pleased to say on that occasion I wasn't the person he was referring to. But
no, I think that's absolutely right, Campbell. We need to have our eyes on the prize and really work towards it, and it will take a lot of persuasion. It will take time, but we need to keep persisting because there's no shortcut. There is no shortcut. We just need to convince the majority of the population of Scotland for the longest time we can, and then things will happen. Things will start to change.
yeah, and you know the reality is we are not far away compared to where we were when I started this.
Yeah.
You know, it's absolutely incredible that we've got to where we have, and in no small part due to Alex's strategic thinking.
Yes.
I joined the SNP the year before Winnie Ewing won Hamilton, so we had nobody. You know, we'd had no one since Dr. Bob way back in 1945. And even after that, it was a long and bumpy road before we got any real traction.
Yeah.
I mean, I represented Motherwell and Wishaw, so I mean, I had actually gone out campaigning with folk that had actually campaigned in Motherwell and Wishaw in 1945. And, you know, we have now an annual dinner in memory because it was quite a thing. Yeah. The first SNP MP it wasn't somewhere in the Highlands, it wasn't somewhere where you might have expected, it was in an industrial heartland. And that's where we did so well in the referendum because we energised people and we had... It was almost the fringes in some cases, folk who had nothing, who actually understood that they could have more in an independent Scotland. And we have to get back to that messaging, I think.
I've campaigned with some of those same people, I think, Marion, because Robert McIntyre also used to fight the old Grangemouth seat in the years. So I look back and I think, gosh, I fought an area, I represented an area that Bob McIntyre fought, Billy Wolfe fought. George Reid represented a small part of it, and of course it was Alex's stomping ground. So I mean, the luminaries of the party, the legacy that's there, and I know that I got to Westminster not primarily on my own efforts, although I put in a fair shift, but on the work that all these guys did over decades before I even came on the scene.
Back in the 1960s, I think the de facto headquarters of the SNP was the Lyric Bar in Bowness.
Well, it certainly was, and I knew quite a few of the characters in the Ballad of Lyric Bar song personally, and as you would as well.
Really old,
and yeah, Jimmy Dewar, and yeah, and a whole host of them. So we've also got a few other people who work with Alec. Kevin Pringle, we've got some comments from Kevin, very insightful. So we'll hear from Kevin next.
Amid the sadness of these last few days, there are just so many memories of Alec. I remember first meeting Alec, it must have been nearly 40 years ago, which is an astonishing thing to say, really. But I was a student at the time, and Alec had not even been elected first time around, so he was the candidate in Banffin-Buchan, so this would have been about 1986. I had just joined the party as a student at Aberdeen University, and I knew his brother Bob very well, because Bob and I were in the same year and in some of the same classes at university. So I knew Bob. I didn't really know of Alex Salmond at all until I occasionally used to read about him in the newspapers and so on. I remember asking Bob if he was related to this person, Alex Salmond. But what Bob used to do actually was to organise a group of students to go up to Banffin-Buchan at the weekend to canvass. So that would be the first time I met Alec. And he used to do a good thing, which was... obviously a long time before email and social media and so on, but when you've been up on a Saturday and done a lot of canvassing in Peterhead or Fraserburgh or thereabouts, you would get a letter, like an old-fashioned letter, you know, the following week in the post, and it would have a little summary, a computer printout of the number of doors that have been chapped, the number of supportive responses, and, you know, the fours and all of that. So it gave you quite a nice feeling that you felt you'd really made a difference because you got this really good bit of intel back as to how the canvass session had done. So I got to know Alec then, and then of course got to know him very much better when I went to work for the party in 1989, and Alec became leader the following year, and it became a close relationship, particularly when I went to work in the communication side of the headquarters function in Edinburgh. And it was such a fascinating time to be there, and Alec's leadership was so important because when he was leader for that first period, that was when Scotland was clearly building up to something really big. So we started the decade of his leadership in 1990 with no parliament, not even much of a prospect of a parliament at that time. But by the end of that decade, there was a Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh. And there's no question about it that SNP pressure was one of the major factors driving the creation of that Parliament. And from that Parliament came an SNP government, and from that government came the independence referendum in 2014. And my abiding memory of Alec in relation to the referendum was really his optimism, I would say, taking a situation where at the beginning of the process, support for independence was perhaps 30% at best, sometimes a little bit less than that, even sometimes a little bit more, but nothing really beyond, say, a third of the electorate. But his optimism and confidence was part and parcel of driving that support up. So there was a belief that the gap could actually be bridged, and we didn't quite make it. But without Alex's optimism, without his belief that we could make it, we would never have got as close as we did. And by coming as close as we did, and it was close, then things happened after the referendum which have enhanced and augmented the powers of the Scottish Parliament. So we have income tax powers, we have welfare powers, which are particularly important, I think, because without that, then we wouldn't have measures like the Scottish Child Payment, for example, which are really important in terms of helping many, many families with low incomes get through this cost of living crisis. So the progress that was made, the relative success, I would say, of the referendum campaign has resulted in real tangible differences, real positive impacts on people's daily lives in Scotland as we speak. And that is a lasting legacy in and of itself. All the measures that are being delivered by the Scottish Parliament, they've got something to do with Alec, because, as I say, I go back to the point that without an SNP that was growing in success, was building support throughout the 1990s, it would have been questionable, in my opinion anyway, as to whether Tony Blair would have gone ahead with devolution when he became Prime Minister, because we know from his autobiography that he was really sceptical at best. So Alec's legacy, really, in terms of the constitutional question, in terms of independence, is taking it from an idea back in the 1980s that was very abstract, very marginal, into something that now is very mainstream. It's a choice. It's not something that sounds outlandish. It's a possibility. It's an option that Scotland may choose to exercise at some point in the future. But when Alec was beginning his political career, it was so far on the margins. Even achieving a Scottish Parliament would have been regarded as at the very high level of ambition. So Alec leaves a very big legacy, but he leaves a Scotland that has been changed significantly, constitutionally, and some of the social and economic measures that we have now, like the child payment. He leaves a country changed and better. That is his legacy.
As people were saying earlier, it's definitely changed the whole dynamic quite considerably. The references to 97 remind me of a whole period of my life that I'd almost forgotten about there. But I think without Alec and the involvement there, we certainly, it wouldn't have been the astonishing victory for the Yes Yes campaign at that time. I think bailed out Donald during the Labour Party to a large extent just by the sheer work that was done. And and perhaps we forget that part because we've moved on from there to the next stage.
Even simple things like changing the name from the Scottish Executive to the Scottish Government, it made a huge difference. It might just be words, but it gave a sign of intent, and you never hear anyone now. I mean, I imagine Labour Party would like to go back to the Scottish Executive and here's your money back, and that's never going to happen again because nobody would actually know what the Scottish Executive is.
Remember what Brian Wilson said about that? He said, when Alec changed the name, he said they can call it the White Heather Club for all I care, and it just sounded so belittling, and it was so out of touch with what had happened in Scottish politics.
And to be absolutely certainly still is, and to a great extent. Perhaps that's a bit mean of me, but and I think that was exemplified when I went to Westminster, and in Westminster people could not understand why people were voting SNP all the time. And I think some of the Tories especially believed there was something in the water. But it was actually Alex's belief in the country and his belief that if you use the right language, it would solidify the idea that Scotland could and should be an independent country.
Absolutely. We've also got some comments from Jim Fairley, who has kindly interrupted his holiday to record a broadcast, so we'll hear from Jim.
I have just watched the video of the repatriation of Alex Salmond's coffin back to Scotland, draped in the saltire as it should be, and I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of sadness for his family and his close friends, and I think a thank you should go to Tom Hunter for actually giving Alec the dignity that he deserved in being repatriated in the way he has been. But I also felt a huge sense of loss to the independence movement in Scotland, because he has undoubtedly been a towering strength and took us so close to becoming an independent country. And I didn't know Alec all that well. I'd met him on a number of occasions, but I didn't know him personally that well. I knew of him, and I have known him for decades because of his relationship, his tetchy relationship with my dad. In fact, it was my dad that actually interviewed him for his very first vetting session of the SNP. And Dad wasn't all that impressed with him. He thought he was a bit arrogant, but as Andy McKeever said on the Hollywood podcast the other day there, that if you've got that arrogance and something to back it up, then you've actually got a pretty good combination, and Alex certainly had that. I spoke to him very recently, and going back to the relationship that he had with my dad, I spoke to him very recently at the funeral of Mary Mitchell. She was a formidable campaigner in my constituency, and that speaks to the man himself, that he knew of Mary, knew Mary, and he made the time and the effort to come to her funeral, because she had been a stalwart of the independence movement as well. And we were talking and we were reflecting, and he said to me he was asking how Dad was, and he said, one of the best debates, if not the best debate that the SNP has ever had, was the 1988 Inverness Conference, where they debated about the SNP's participation in the Constitutional Convention. And he said, if you ever wanted to teach people how to debate, just get the video of that, put it out there, because the participation of everybody who took part in that debate was absolutely phenomenal. And he said it was one of the most enduring memories he's had, and without doubt one of the best debates he's ever taken part in and witnessed. So we had a quiet reflection about that, just, as I say, less than 3 weeks ago. And it's that process that led us to the reconvening of our Scottish Parliament, and, as I say, being so close to independence. And we now have to deal with the fact that we have lost one of the giants of that movement. But I hope what it does is it allows us to reflect, and we cannot shy away from the fact that we've had some difficult times over the last number of years, and to consider, where do we go from here? And I hope, and I genuinely believe, that this is an opportunity for us to reconvene and to think again about what it is that we all desire, and that is an independent Scotland, and how we get there. And I hope that this becomes that moment where we can get together, we can bring the movement back together, and we can deliver the dream that shall never die, and that is an independent Scotland. For people like Alec, and for all those people who have gone before, who gave their heart and soul when it was nothing more than an idea, and now it is very much a touching distance reality. So I hope that we now do what we need to do to bring ourselves back together and deliver that independent Scotland.
Well, I think that's the message that we need to inspire the wider movement with. It's how can we all work together, and as Campbell said earlier, it does mean shelving egos and just knuckling down and finding that common ground. And
having said that, the fact that Alec is sadly no longer with us takes away a blockage to a certain extent, because there's no doubt, I mean, we were all friends of Alex and admired him and loved him, but he was a divisive character, both within the movement and within the electorate. So it does, perhaps, as Jim says, give us an opportunity to move on, and people who might have balked at joining a wider independence movement because Alec was involved would now come on board. We can only hope.
Yeah, time will tell.
Yes.
And how it pans out is largely down to all of us.
Yes.
Indeed.
Marion, did you want to?
No, I just absolutely agree with Campbell. Alex was a divisive figure. He was a man of many parts, and one of my fondest memories of him was I was sweeping the lobby, as you do in Westminster, and Alex came in and he said, "Are you sweeping the lobby?" I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "You have to check the toilets, all of them." I said, "Yes, I do. I know that." I said, "I tell you what, you do the gents and I'll do the ladies." And he looked at me and he did the gents and I did the ladies. And then we walked out together, all out. Now, people would find that quite surprising in some regards, but I found Alex personally, he liked a challenge. He liked you to stand up to him. He liked you not to be a yay-sayer all the time. And he was really, really good company if you were out having a meal.
It didn't always feel like that when you're on the receiving end of the phone call, I have to say.
No, but, and that's the thing. I mean, because he was a giant in the movement, and because he was so well versed. I mean, I remember asking him once, very early on when I first knew him, he gave a speech at a conference or a national council probably, and I said, "I could have a copy of that," because I was still learning the trade. And he handed me this bit of paper, which was like a post-it note with about 5 words on it. And he'd spoken for 20 minutes, and that was it, And that kind of way of doing things was exactly how he was a master of his brief. He knew what he was talking about. I remember Jennifer Erickson telling me that when he did a speech, I think it was in the House of Commons, on the economy, she asked him for something and he gave her literally the back of a fact packet, and there were a few notes on it. And you don't come across people like that very often, and that's why I think he was a giant, because he really knew what he was talking about, and he had a good conceit of himself with good reason.
He could pull those facts out of the hat whenever he needed them, which was the impressive.
But Martyn, you're talking about the phone call occasionally you would get. As a media special advisor, sometimes I had to be up in Butte House if he was going on Good Morning Scotland at 8 o'clock in the morning, and you'd get up there about 7 o'clock to go through the papers and then brief him about anything that might be in the papers, because he'd be going on to speak about a specific subject, but they were always liable to throw something left field from what was in that morning's papers. Yeah. So woe betide if he was asked something that you hadn't briefed him on. And there's one or two times there's a tiny little lift in Butte House, and he would say, "Come up to the flat afterwards." And to be in that tiny little lift with Alex Salmond after he'd been asked a question which you hadn't briefed him about was not a pleasant place to be.
One can only imagine.
Yes. we can imagine only too well. We've got a range of tributes that were paid out in the Commons, which I think, actually was appropriate. It had to be done via a point of order in order for it to be done procedurally. So we will hear now a few of the more interesting ones from across, not just our movement, but from some of our fellow travellers and some opponents as well.
We come to a point of order, urgent question. I'll deal with it in a slightly different way than normal. Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On a point of order. In the wee hours of the 9th of June 2017, I watched on as the most talented, formidable and consequential politician of his generation. A man who had represented the people of Banff and Buchan, Aberdeenshire East and Gordon. A man who had served for 2 terms as the First Minister of Scotland, lost his parliamentary seat for the first time in 30 years. And it's a moment that I will never forget, not because of the nature of his defeat, but for what happened next. Because within just a few moments, Alex Salmond took to the podium and gave a speech which, despite all of the despair which those of us in the SNP felt in the room that night, made us feel 10 feet tall. He gave us back the hope that things would get better and would get better quickly. Rabbi Burns once wrote that the heart's eye, the part's eye that makes us right or wrong. Well, Alex gave all of us in the SNP the belief that what we felt in our hearts was worth fighting for, that the belief that we could one day become an independent nation, and Alex Salmond took us so very close to making that belief a reality. At this time of profound shock and sorrow, Mr Speaker, I send my heartfelt personal condolences to his wife Moira, his wider family, his friends and his legion of fans across the nationalist movement and within the Alba Party itself. It's of great personal sorrow to me that Alex Salmond will not live to see Scotland become an independent nation. The challenge for all of us now in the nationalist movement is to make sure that we put good his legacy and deliver the future that he so badly fought for throughout his distinguished parliamentary career. Thank you.
It is difficult to overstate the influence that Alex Salmond has had on the national movements, not just in Scotland, but in Wales too. He has always been a true friend of my party, Plaid Cymru. He is respected and will be respected into the future for his extraordinary resilience and optimism. He made the campaign for Scotland's independence a political reality, and he changed the course of his nation. That is undeniable. As I said, he was a friend to Wales. My friend Peter here already mentioned his many facets. Our former leader, David Wigley, was to invite Alex Salmond to speak in a conference on the Welsh poet R.S. Thomas. I don't know how many people would have expected that, but R.S. Thomas and Welsh poetry was one of Alex's enthusiasms. Every sympathy from my party, Plaid Cymru, to Moira, to Alex's friends, to Alex's family, and to our colleagues in our sister party, the SNP. And I'm sure everyone here sends deepest commiserations.
Allowed this time to pay tribute to Alex Salmond because he absolutely well deserves it, and I think it's great we're doing that. And the leader of the SNP spoke very well and very movingly about Alex's contribution to life, and I think that's very generous because the SNP clearly treats its former leaders with great respect, and I think that's a good idea. I also thank the member for Halton, Price and Howden for what he said, because Alex Salmond did go through the most appalling stress, personal pressure, and no doubt he had moments of self-doubt and real concern about the whole thing. And I think the fact that the member of Halton Price spoke so well about it really is a testament to what Alex was actually made of. During his time here, he was a good friend to lots of us. He always opposed wars. He always stood up for civil liberties and for justice. And his strength of character in Scotland and the wider world actually made the SNP the party it is, the formidable force it became, and it made the arguments for Scottish independence something that was cogent, realistic and understandable. And I think we should just remember Alex Salmond lived life to the full, spoke to the full, was totally involved in absolutely everything he did, and was this amazing, actually very friendly force around this place. And I, for one, will miss him and send my condolences to Moira and to all of his wider family and all of his colleagues in both Alba and the SNP in Scotland.
Yeah. Okay. So Desmond Swain.
Mr. Speaker, he was a great friend at university and also in this House. And despite political differences, I speak from personal experience, he was a man capable of very great kindness. And I shall certainly miss him, and Moira certainly has my condolences.
Mr. Speaker, I associate myself with so many of the comments from members across the House. I first encountered Alex Salmond when I was a starstruck teenager, a member of the 79 group, attending a particularly fractious SNP conference in Ayr in 1982. Indeed, so fractious was the conference that Alex was subsequently expelled from the party, albeit briefly. But in the meetings that followed, even though he was just less than 10 years older than myself, I listened to this spellbinding oratory of this young man, and he was destined for greatness then. We became close allies in the late 1980s, and I was part of the campaign team which saw him elected SNP leader in 1990. Our paths clearly took wildly different trajectories, but we kept in touch on and off over the decades, and I can say that I wouldn't be here today were it not for Alec having arranged for me to go through to Edinburgh so he could persuade me to put my hat in the ring for the SNP in Argyll and Bute in the 2015 election. And I know that I am far from being alone in being an SNP politician who owes so much, a huge debt to Alex Salmond. He was, Mr. Speaker, a titan of our movement, an irreplaceable force without whom our independence, when it does come, which it surely will, would never have been achieved. My thoughts, as are so many in this House, are with Moira. My experience of Moira is that she was a very quiet but absolutely formidable force. And I learned very quickly that if you want to get Alec to change his mind, you don't go to Alec, you go to Moira, because Moira was an incredible force in herself. So my deepest condolences and sympathy are with Moira and with his immediate family. And I do wonder, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to Alex Salmond, when will we see his like again?
Well, there we have a few very touching and fitting remarks from across the board. I mean, I've been trawling through some of my memories and recollections, and the more you think about things or other people mention them, it comes into mind other stories. And I think if we all went around the country telling these positive stories, we might just get the whole movement reignited because he had such an impact on so many different people. I was putting some items together and looking at some old photos. I know I've got other stuff in the loft, but Tam Smith's by-election in 97, 3 weeks after the referendum, and we'd asked Alec he asked how he could help, when we approached him, and Tam got him to sign his nomination papers because he lived in Lithgow at the time, so that was quite a big coup. And we said, well, we can cope with a by-election. We knew how to campaign. We'd been well trained in West Lothian, but we need your help on polling day. And he was leader of the party and one of the few MPs we had, and by gosh, he was there on polling day and he put in one hell of a shift. I recall his reverse gear packed in the car, but he still went round dragging them out, and he was dragging people out of the houses in their pyjamas. to vote for Tam, and we won that by-election, and that was us, I think, firmly back on the road at that time, and we need a bit more of that, and there's lessons there for all of us. So we've all got so many memories from Alec. Do you want to say any final remarks, Campbell?
No, I just I still can hardly believe that he's not with us. He was such a big part of not just the movement, but my life professionally, first as a journalist and then as a special advisor, and latterly when I was his media spokesperson. And I feel heartbroken for Moira. I know she'll have been swamped over the past few days, and I deliberately haven't phoned her or contacted her because I know there are plenty of people around her already. But I hope she's doing well, and I hope she gets through this okay.
I think programmes like this can only make you sadder and make you realise what a huge loss he is to the independence movement, and how there's always going to be wee reminders going forward, and that's what we have to do. We've said often in the party we stand on the shoulders of giants. Yeah. With Alec, he was a political giant, and we definitely need to summon up some of his will and move independence forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure we'll hear many, many more stories from across the country over the next few days. It was very fitting, I think, how his body was brought back today. And you saw how on the international stage people revered senior politicians from this country, and I think we all long to the day when we're all there on that international stage getting that recognition. But we saw a glimpse of it today, and hopefully that just sets a wee spark in a few more minds that the world is watching us, so how we behave is significantly important. We've got a final tune, because Alec liked his Scottish music as well, and we've got a recording from Greg McCara, who did this one for Broadcasting Scotland for Hogmanay, but has said it would be very fitting to play tonight, so we're going to have a parting glass as we go out. So we will hear this coming on fairly soon. And
a parting glass being a Scottish song, lots of people think it's an Irish song. It's actually first published in Scotland.
Of all the money that I've spent it in good company, and all the harm that I've done, alas, it was to none but me. And since it was for want of wit to memory now I can't recall, so fill to me a parting glass. Good night and joy be with you all. Of all the comforts that I've had, are sorry for my going away, and all that I've had would wish me one more days to stay. And since it falls unto my lot that I should rise and you should not, I'll gently rise and I'll softly call good night and joy